Well, go ahead and get started. And we read a few Gandharan texts, and we talked about the five spiritual forces, which was an interesting text that in that make this in comes from Gandhara. There are many different formulations of virtues, but this particular one was a specialty of Gandhara. There's another very interesting text that comes from Gandhara and Gandharan literature that exists. What's been found recently that they're still working on translating. But there's a text that shows up in the Pali canon, but only in Burma, nowhere, and not in Sri Lanka or anywhere else. And there's also a Chinese translation of part of it. And it's called the Debate of King Milinda. And it purports to tell the story of a Buddhist monk, Nagasena, who holds together with a Greek who rules in Gandhara and has a discussion about Dharma where the king puts a lot of questions about the Buddhist Dharma of Nagasena. So it's a very interesting text. They believe that Milinda, versus the Greek king Meander, who was a famous Greek king of that part of the world, left over from Alexander's days, and he ruled about 150 BC. And it's unlikely that he was so educated to Buddhist Dharma that he could hold a debate on hear me read, because it's very subtle. But whoever wrote text, and it must not have been much past then, because Oak, the king, people would have had to remember who it was. So we're talking like the 1st century BC. Somebody pens this extraordinary text for a Buddhist text, very well written, and it's this purported debate between this king and this Buddhist master. And for the time period, which is very early in the Buddhist history, it's one of the earliest Buddhist texts we probably have. It's surprisingly sophisticated in terms of its meditative understanding and anticipating a lot of ideas that will later show up in particularly in Mahayana Buddhism. And then it also sort of the idea of the master's, the question response. You get that a lot in Zen literature. Zen literature is all the master and the student, and they're all trained to ask questions, trying to challenge each other's understanding. And that kind of back and forth is established in a particular text. So, without further ado, so this is going to cover a whole lot of different topics in Buddhism. There's actually the text that which is a Debate of King Milinda. There are different translations of it. This is a condensed version based on a translation of the longer sutra. As I said, it's called paracanonical because it only exists in one canon, which makes it very unusual. The Chinese have a version of it, and their version has only the first. There's a sort of two parts to the text. So the first part, the Chinese, and that's its whole story by itself. And then what happened with the Pali version that ended up in Burma was that they added a lot of other kind of stories and sayings and teachings that stretched it out about 3 times more at length. And that's a common process. It happens like with Chung Tzu. They're sort of called the famous inner chapters of Chung Tzu, which are considered to be the oldest layer. And then people kept writing additional Chung Tzu literature that's not quite as good as the first part, and that goes on. So we're going to go through, I think I'll just read through the whole first part, which is quite good, and then we'll dive a little bit in the second part. So this has a very elaborate backstory before we get to the actual questioning that goes on between the king and the monk. So the debate of King Milinda. In the city of Sagala, Milinda was the king. He was learned in the arts and sciences and was of an inquiring disposition. He was skilled in debating, and no one could resolve his doubts about religious matters. He questioned the famous teachers, but none of them could satisfy him. Asagutta, one of a large number of arhats living in the Himalayas, knew of the king's doubts by means of supernormal power. So he convened an assembly to ask if there was anyone who could answer the king. There was no one, so the whole assembly ascended to the heaven of the 33 and requested the god Mahasena to take birth as a man in order to protect the religion. One of the monks, Rohana, agreed to go to Kanjangali, where Mahasena had been reborn, and wait for him to grow up. The boy's father, Brahman Sanuttara, had the boy educated in the 3 Vedas, but the boy Nagasena declared, "Empty are these 3 Vedas, and they are like chaff. There is in them neither reality, worth, nor essential truth." Realizing that the boy was ready, Rohana appeared out, and the parents considered their son becoming a novice monk. And so Nagasena studied the Abhidharma. After gaining perfect knowledge of the 7 books of Abhidharma, Nagasena was admitted to the order of monks, and Rohanga sent him to the Vartaniya hermitage to study with Asagutta. While spending the rainy season there, Nagasena was asked to preach a sermon to the pious lady who was Agasutta's supporter. As a result of the discourse, both the lady and Nagasena attained the Dharma Chakra, the knowledge that whatever has a beginning also has an inherent quality of passing away. Asagutta then sent Nagasena to Dharmakirita in Ashoka Part in Paliputra, where within the space of the 3 months he mastered the remainder of the Tripitaka. Dharmakirita admonished his pupil not to be content with mere book knowledge, and the very same night the diligent pupil Nagasena attained arhatship. He then went to join the other arhats who were still staying in the Himalayas. Having completed his education, Nagasena was ready to meet anyone in debate. So in the first part of our story, we get this incredible background for the monk Nagasena. So after, recall, this text is being written in Gandhara. It's being written, 1st century BC. So it's in this bit of and here in Gandhara, there is this great hero of the Dharma, this great Buddhist master. And at this time period, which is very early, he's an Abhidharma master. Now, Abhidharma is going to mean the highest of the Dharma. He understands all the essentials of the Dharma. the subtleties. And he reads all of the Abhidharma, he goes through a period of study, and then he also has to do the period of meditation, although in this case, his meditation training is fairly brief. But at any rate, Nagasena, who is, of course, he's the rebirth of a god, because nobody on earth is equipped to go and answer these questions. So presumably as a deity in previous lives, he got quite a bit of meditation in. So all in all, a very extraordinary person here. Nagasena is going to go and debate and discuss Dharma with the Greek king. So now back to our story. Meanwhile, King Milinda, or Meander is the way the Greeks would say it, continued his spiritual quest by visiting the bhikshu Ayutthapala at the Samaheka hermitage, who asked him why the monks renounced the world. The elder replied, "It is for the sake of being able to live in righteousness and in spiritual calm." Then the king asked, "Is there, venerable sir, any layman who lives so?" The elder admitted that there were many such laymen, and the king retorted, "Then, most venerable Ayutthha, your going forth is of no use. It must be in consequences of sins committed in some former birth that recluses renounce the world, and even subject themselves to the added constraints of one another the ascetic practices, such as wearing only rag robes, eating only one meal a day, or not lying down to sleep. There is no virtue therein, no meritorious abstinence, no righteousness of life." When the king had spoken thus, the venerable Ayutthapala was silenced and had not a word to say. Then the 500 Bactrian Greeks who accompanied the king said, "The elder is learned, but he is also diffident, so he makes no reply." To this the king replied by exclaiming, "All India is an empty thing, it is like chaff. There is no one capable of debating with me and dispelling my doubts." But at this the Bactrian Greeks were unmoved, so the king asked, "Is there then, my good men, any other learned sage who is able to discuss things with me and dispel my doubts?" Then the minister Deva Mantiaga said, "There is, great king, an elder named Nagasena, who is learned, of subdued manners, yet full of courage. He is capable of discussing with you. He is now staying at the Samyaka hermitage. You should go and put your questions to him." At the mere mention of the name, Nagasena, the king became alarmed, and the hairs on his body stood on end. Then the king sent a messenger to say he was coming, and attended by the 500 Bactrian Greeks, the king mounted his royal chariot and proceeded to the place where Nagasena was staying. So now we meet the king, and he's ready to have some intelligent discussion, which is apparently a hard thing to find out there in the wilds of Asia. And you'll notice this will come up later in this particular book, which has some Mahayana ideas lurking in it. And one is, you say, well, why if lay people can also become enlightened without following the discipline of the monks, and they always have to say yes, in fact many have, then why are you following it being a monk? And they're going to come back with a number of different defenses for that, lifestyles being particularly well suited for liberation. But at this point, when the king asks that question of this a garden variety aesthetic, he doesn't have a good answer for that. So that's when the king starts to denigrate India a little bit, and then somebody, of course, has to step and say, well, of course, you haven't met Nagasena yet. And you know, it's almost like Milrepa meaning, Marpa meaning, what is it? It's Milrepa meaning Marpa, where, you know, sometimes they just hear the name. There's a standard literary device in the Tibetan stories where the Tibetan student just hears the name of his teacher and just right then and there, and like he just like knows, and the hairs on his stand on end and stuff. So when the time is right, the meeting occurs. Now, with all this buildup, you would think they would be discussing very celestial kinds of cosmic questions, but they really get down to very detailed points of philosophy. This is the kind of discussion the king was looking for. Of course, he said before that he's a skilled investigator. He's somebody who does inquiry. He is, in a sense, going to be portrayed quite well, actually, by the writer of the text as a Greek philosopher. So we're getting a Greek philosopher in the 1st century BC meeting the Buddhist master. And there's only one piece of this in all of Buddhist literature. So we get chapter 1, the soul. King Milinda went to Nagasena, and after exchanging polite and friendly greetings, took his seat respectively to one side. Milinda began by asking, "How is your reverence known, and what, sir, is your name?" "O king, I am known as Nagasena, but that is only a designation in common use, where no permanent individual can be found." And Milinda called upon the Bactrian Greeks and the monks to bear witness. "This Nagasena says that no permanent individual is implied in his name. Is it possible to approve of that?" Then he turned to Nagasena and said, "If most venerable Nagasena, that is true, who is it who gives you robes, food, and shelter? Who lives the righteous life? Or again, who kills living beings, steals, commits adultery, tells lies, or takes strong drink? If what you say is true, then there is neither merit nor demerit, nor is there any doer of good or evil deeds and no result of karma. If, venerable sir, a man were to kill you, there would be no murder, and it follows that there are no masters or teachers in your order. You say that you are called Nagasena. Now what is that, Nagasena? Is that the hair?" "I didn't say that, great king." "Is it then the nails, the teeth, the skin, the other parts of the body?" "Certainly not." "Or is it the body, or feelings, or perceptions, or formations, or consciousness? Is it all of these combined, or is it something outside of them that is Nagasena?" And still Nagasena answered, "It is none of these." "Then ask as I may, I can discover no Nagasena. Nagasena is an empty sound. Who is it we see before us? It is a falsehood that your reverence has spoken." So that's the king's opening attack on the master here. He goes right to it. And Nagasena replies, "Okay. You, sir, have been reared in great luxury as becomes your noble birth. How did you come here? By foot or in a chariot?" "In a chariot, venerable sir." "Then explain, sir, what that is. Is it the axle? Or the wheels? Or the chassis? Or the reins? Or the yoke that is the chariot? Is it all of these combined, or is it something apart from them?" "It is none of these things, venerable sir." "Then, sir, this chariot is an empty sound. You spoke falsely with it. You said you came here in a chariot. You are a great king of India. Who are you afraid of that you speak an untruth?" And he called upon the Bactrian Greeks and the monks to bear witness. "This King Milinda said that he came here by chariot, but when asked what is it, he is unable to show it. Is it possible to approve of that?" Then the 500 Bactrian Greeks shouted their approval and said to the king, "Get out of that if you can." "Venerable sir, I have spoken the truth," the king said. "It is because it has all these parts that it comes under the name chariot." "Very good, sir. Your majesty has rightly grasped the meaning. Even so, it is because of the 32 kinds of organic matter in a human body and the 5 aggregates of being that I come under the name Nagasena. As is said by Sister Vusha in the presence of the Blessed One, just as it is by the existence of the various parts that the word chariot is used, just so it is that when the aggregates of being are there, we talk of a being. Most wonderful, Nagasena, most extraordinary, that you have solved this puzzle, difficult though it was. If the Buddha himself were here, he would approve of your reply." Of course, these king starts out very strong, but he caves in pretty quickly. But, that's typical of these stories. So the first one, we're going to do the whole idea of the Buddha's self. And you can see here that this is firmly going to be an exposition of the Abhidharma. That's what Nagasena is a master of. He's a master of the Abhidharma. We're going to get the Abhidharma in a very palatable way here. So the first question is really about what it is that there's a self. And Nagasena says, well, there's no one really here, but what you see is just simply a collection of aggregates in a name attached to that. And that is an example that's classically used here is that of the chariot. There is actually no such thing as a chariot. Apart from all the materials that went into making a chariot. And we have the materials arranged in that way by common agreement. We call that object a chariot, but there is no actual natural chariots roaming about. And similarly, we're just a continual flux of different impulses, thoughts, moods, physical sensations, sense perceptions. We hear things, we see things, we smell things. And that whole tumble in our mind of all that going on, 8 or 10 different kinds of mental events or more, just sort of flowing around, like a big, vegetables in a soup or something. That's sort of a bit of the Buddhist idea here, is that we're just sort of a bundle of all of these different mental qualities. And later on in the Abhidharma, they're in fact going to enumerate exactly what we are. We're like the 5 skandhas, but you can break that down further. There's different sense perceptions, there's different emotions that we come up with. And so there's 100 elements of existence. And that's what constitutes reality, are all these minute things, and they're just being combined and recombined, sort of like, molecules. So if you imagine that, right now we're a bunch of molecules in the form of a human body. At some point our molecules will disperse, those molecules become part of new other objects, and molecules are just like moving, going from place to place, forming different kinds of objects. And of course, with us, psychologically, that's true from day to day, because each day we wake up, our aggregates just sort of, have this particular spin for that day, and every day is a unique mix of mental bubbling as well as external events, because we're not just bubbling alone, we're all bubbling together. We're just like one like a herb bouquet in the soup, and there's a bunch of everything else floating around as well, which affects it all. So that's the opening gamut, and the king actually is going to pursue this a little bit more on this idea of no self. So he goes on. How many rains do you have, Nagasena? Now, rains means how many times have you wintered over in the rainy season with the other monks? So he's been a monk for 7 years. And presumably, he's probably he's a 20-something, maybe a late 20-something at this point. So he's a very young master to have reached the state of arhatship. And arhatship means sort of he's the kind of the fully liberated person at this time. It's like being as a master. So these arhats are really Buddhist masters in the sense of a Zen master or a Tibetan master. So the king begins, "How many reigns do you have, Nagasena?" "7, your majesty." "But how can you say it is your 7? Is it you who are 7, or is it the number that is 7? And Nagasena said, "Your shadow is now on the ground. Are you the king, or is the shadow the king?" "I am the king, Nagasena, but the shadow comes into being because of me." "Just so, O king. The number of years is 7. I am not 7, but it is because of me that the number 7 comes into being, and it is mine in the same sense as the shadow is yours." "Most wonderful, Nagasena, most extraordinary. Well, has this puzzle been solved by you, difficult as it was?" "Wasn't terribly difficult, but whatever." Then the king, this is now in the third one. Then the king said, "Venerable sir, will you discuss with me again?" "If your majesty will discuss as a scholar, yes. But if you will discuss as a king, no." "How is it then that scholars discuss?" "When scholars discuss, there is summing up, unraveling. One or other is shown to be in error, and he admits his mistake and yet is not thereby angered." "How is it that kings discuss?" "When a king discusses a matter, he advances a point of view. If anyone differs from him on that point of view, he is apt to punish him." "Very well, then, it is the scholar that I will discuss. Let your reverence talk without fear." "It is well, your majesty." "Nagasena, I will ask a question," said the king. "Ask it, sir." "I have asked it, your reverence. Then I have answered." "What have you answered? What have you asked?" So here you get like a classic Zen repartee here about 1,000 years earlier. Thinking, this monk is a great scholar. He is quite able to discuss with me. The king invited Deva Mantanyaga, his minister, to invite him to the palace with a large company of monks, and went away muttering, "Nagasena, Nagasena." So that's the initial meeting of the king and Nagasena. I can read more. Any comments so far? Questions? You're all muted. You can't talk.
So the Abhidharma, where talking about all those different particles, just combining and recombining. Is that there's all those early schools? Is that like Sarvastivada, and is that held to be like those are absolutely
pretty much through the different schools, although there are slight variations. Among the so-called Hinyan schools, of the 18 early schools, not very many which are that well documented. The Theravada is well documented because they still exist, and Sarvastivadins because that's who the group was that the Tibetans translated them, and the Chinese, I think, as well. But they had slight differences in how real the dharmas were, but generally the dharmas, these constituent elements, were held to be kind of like people used to think of the atoms and molecules. That the atoms and molecules were actual physical, substances. In the same way, things like eye consciousness and then touch consciousness and scent consciousness and the scent organs, the eyes, the consciousness, and the object. Those are 18 of the dharmas to start with. And then, like, there's 50 dharmas that are moods, like shame, jealousy, and there are good ones and there are bad ones. We'll go through the whole list later on of all the different kinds of emotions and kind of virtues and non-virtues. And you think, well, what kind of reality is this? And I mean, that's kind of the key question, because we say, well, they're realists because they believe that these dharmas were real, and then later on, the Mahayana, they question that even these dharmas are empty. Well, what kind of reality are they portraying? I mean, that's the essential question here. And if you're talking about an experiential reality, which is what Buddhism is going to be talking about, then certain kinds of things like shame or greed or grasping or they're realities of our conscious experience. And it's out of these pieces of conscious experience or mental events that and that's what's going on. Is there's a series of mental events going on all the time, and it's like and it's always turning like a kaleidoscope. And you got the certain kinds of pieces of glass with 100 pieces of glass in the kaleidoscope, but depending on how it mixes, it can form all kinds of different images. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going on here in this view of the world that Nagasena represents. That reality is just that these pieces of glass, but then they can be combined to create the illusion of real beings, of real personalities, and real selves, and substance, and permanency, and none of which they actually have.
So does the Mahayana emptiness critique of that? Does it actually add anything to it, or is it just is it a real critique then? Because if they're mental or real experiential realities, or does it?
Well, by saying that all of this is shunyata, or empty, or shunya, empty, in a way, the Mahayana is being more essential or simplistic. That what's the point of enumerating all this stuff? It's just concept, And yes, I mean, of course there are experiences, and of course you can give them names, and of course experience, in a certain, psychological way. When I make a description of it, this is, in fact, a superb description of human psychology. In fact, it's better than anything the West has still come up with. Abhidharma psychology is much deeper. I mean, people are just starting to get to that in the West. But the Mahayana point of view, why are we talking about psychology all the time? Let's just experience Buddha nature, suchness, full Buddhahood right here, right now.
So it's even though it's exquisite and superb, it's a trap, or it's a side road or something.
Yeah, it's I think there's in a sense you could say that the Abhidharma is too much in their head, too analytical, and not enough in the heart, and not enough in the moment, from the Mahayana point of view. But if you're going to be in your head, you're going to be analytical. It's a superb level of analytical insight going on here. And at this point in time, remember, we're back in where we are, 21 centuries ago. Analytical insight was much less common. They didn't have universities where people were paid to, do this all the time.
Right.
I mean, this Buddhism and Greek philosophy, and it's also, both of these are analytical based, and this is something new in the world, and very few people are able to even put two thoughts together in this kind of manner. So the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni Buddha, is remarkably analytical. At the same time, he has this presence, he has this genuine heart, spontaneity going on as well. So it's possible you can have complete access to both if you're Buddha.
Thank you.
Well, we'll read on. So we left our king. The king and Nagasena have met, and the king is impressed with his meeting. So he's going to go. Nagasena is going to come to the palace with some monks. So the minister and the other officials went to Nagasena's hermitage to accompany the monks to the palace. As they were walking along together, Anakadaya said to Nagasena, "When your reverence, I say Nagasena, what is that Nagasena?" "What do you think that Nagasena is?" "The soul, the inner breath which comes and goes." "But if that breath, having gone out, should not return, would that man still be alive?" "Certainly not. But when those trumpeters and the like have blown their trumpets, does their breath return to them?" "No, venerable sir." "Then why don't they die?" "I am not capable of arguing with you, sir. Pray, tell me how it is." "There is no soul in the breath. These inhalations and exhalations are merely constituent powers of the bodily frame." Then Nagasena talked to him about the Abhidharma, and they were satisfied with his explanation. So you can get a sense Nagasena is going to be, in the manner the Greeks will appreciate, fairly rational in terms of his explanation. Number 5. Then after the monks had arrived at the palace and had finished their meal, the king sat down on a low seat and asked, "What shall we discuss?" "Let our discussion be about the Dharma." And the king said, "What is the purpose, your reverence, of your going forth? And what is the final goal at which you aim?" Going forth is going forth on the monastic path, or renouncing the world. "Our going forth is for the purpose that this suffering may be extinguished, and that no further suffering may arise. The complete extinction of grasping without remainder is our final goal." "Is it, venerable sir, for such noble reasons that everyone joins the order?" "No. Some enter to escape the tyranny of kings, some to be safe from robbers, some to escape from debt, and some perhaps to gain a livelihood. But those who enter rightly do so for the complete extinction of grasping." So you can see that Nagasena is pretty firmly in this early tradition that the ultimate goal, what makes you an arhat, what makes you a master of this early tradition, is desirelessness, extinction of grasping, not having any desires, not having even the desire for further becoming or further existence, to be completely desireless. And that's the purpose of going forth. Now the king's going to head on a different direction here, which is fun. The king said, "Is there anyone who is not reborn after death?" Nagasena says, "Yes, there is. The one who has no defilements is not reborn after death. The one who has defilements is reborn. Will you be reborn?" "If I die with craving in my mind, yes." but if not, no. You can see Nagasena very clever here. It's not important about the person, it's the principle. The principle is if you can eliminate your desires in this life, then you will not be reborn. And you will not even have the desire to be reborn, because that itself would be a desire, any kind of rebirth. I was thinking about that today. There's no way you could be reborn on earth, in heaven, any other kind of realm, even a pure land. Every kind of rebirth, it means that you're going to have to take on new projects. And that means you're going to have to do new work and new exertion. And it'll be something less than perfect relaxation taking place if you have to be reborn, because you'll have to, put some energy into, checking out your surroundings and all of that. So even the best situations, rebirth is a lot of work. So when you realize that, then it's very easy to realize that what do I even want to be reborn for? I want that perfect peace that doesn't even desire any kind of new project whatsoever. Number 7, does one who escapes from rebirth do so by the power of reasoning? Augustina. He escapes both by reasoning and by wisdom, confidence, virtue, mindfulness, energy, and by concentration. So here you get our categories that we had last time with a couple additional ones, but reasoning is part of wisdom. So wisdom, confidence, which is our faith, that we talked about last time. Wisdom, faith, virtue is just, we talked about conduct as the foundation last time. Then you get mindfulness, energy, and concentration or samadhi. So these 5 forces of faith, energy, mindfulness, samadhi, and wisdom is a very, this is kind of very much at the heart of this Gandharan approach here. These are, again, the 5 spiritual forces are a very basic formulation of the path in Gandhara. And then the king asks, is reasoning the same as wisdom? And Nagasena answers, no. Animals have reason, but they don't have wisdom. So the reason, the analytical inquiry, or be able to put, things together in a logical way, animals have a capacity for that to a limited degree, but according to Nagasena, they don't have wisdom. Wisdom being insight into the whole, or direct insight here. And he's going to go on and explain this more. Number 8, what, Nagasena, is the characteristic mark of reasoning, and what is the mark of wisdom? Taking hold is the mark of reasoning. Cutting off is the mark of wisdom. Giving me an illustration. How do barley reapers reap the barley? They grasp the barley into a bunch with the left hand, and with a sickle in the right hand they cut the barley. Just so, O king, the recluse takes hold of his mind with reasoning and cuts off the defilements with wisdom. So wisdom is the special insight that allows you to see the fruitlessness of all bad conduct. And reasoning is what brings this to your attention. Now, of course, in Dzogchen, we'll go a little step further here. Your mind, your reasoning, you'll get your mind in one place. Then in Trekcho, I just cut it all off. We're not just cutting off defilements, we just cut the mind off altogether. Because all the defilements are essentially mind created. So if you stop believing in your thoughts, start believing what you're saying to yourself, then that's just cutting off, and you're just then left in the pure presence where everything is that it is without having to be conceptualized. And the king persists. What is the character? Oh, he's going to go through these 5 forces that we talked about. What in Augustine is the characteristic mark of virtue? Supporting, O king, for it is the basis of all the good qualities. And we talked about that last week from the different texts. Conduct is the basis of all good qualities. The 5 controlling faculties, those are the 5 spiritual energies that we talked about last week. And then 5 moral powers, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the 8 factors of the noble path, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of success, the 4 absorptions, the 8 freedoms, the 4 modes of concentration, the 8 great attainments. Each of these has virtue as its support, and in him who builds on it, the foundation of these good conditions will not decrease. Give me an illustration. Just as, O king, all forms of animal and vegetable life flourish when the earth is their support, so does the recluse with virtue or good conduct as a support develop the 5 controlling faculties, the 5 spiritual forces, and so on. Then when a wise man, and this is said by the Blessed One Shakyamuni when he said, when a wise man established well in virtue develops concentration and understanding, then as a bhikshu, ardent and sagacious, he succeeds in disentangling the tangle. So once again, we get an early discussion of these various qualities that are going to be characteristic of the Abhidharma, and that is you have these various lists of teachings, and like the 4 foundations of mindful, the 8-fold path, the 5 spiritual forces. So there is a kind of reflection that's going on all the time about these kinds of forces, spiritual forces in the universe, the way things are set up, and so forth. And so that's the kind of analytical work that is being done within the Abhidharma, is to get you to sort of see, learn through this very the expedient of all these shortcut lists, the sort of basic principles, and they've got sort of the whole path kind of broken into very relatively easy, memorable set of teachings that you can learn as an aspiring practitioner.
So, you're talking about renouncing the world and perfect peace, and so is this early philosophical basis of Buddhism, the whole renunciate tradition and all of this? Is it essentially life denying, or is it just is that just a kind of a trope that gets thrown at it? I know, like Vajrayana flips it, but do they fundamentally change it, or I'm not sure what I'm asking. Perfect peace sounds really, really nice, but it also sounds a little bit like life denial in a sense.
Well, that's the delicate and subtle nature of the path. It's to realize that peace, and lay people can realize peace, and the monastics can realize peace, and wanderers can realize peace. So there's different kinds of communities. There's the person in a family situation working out in the world, but who's centered and practicing and learning and developing in the world. Then there's the monastic situation where they've simplified their lives to the most simple level you can and stay alive, sustain your life without any frills. And that kind of simplicity is not considered a deprivation as much as it is sort of refreshing, or being free. Is like you're no longer burdened by all these worldly concerns and cares, and taking care of a family and taking care of property, and worrying where your next meal is going to come from, and worrying about work, and worrying about this and worrying about that. And we know, there's a lot of that kind of stuff, worrying about all sorts of things. And so it's really, you have to think of it as a higher, it's better in the sense that it's creates an ideal situation for practice. And then for those who are really able to be alone, wandering out in the woods with just your tree underneath your tree, that's the heroic recluse ideal, totally, because that's the most simple. You abandon even the props of any kind of social interaction, which makes things even simpler yet. Now, from the tantric point of view, is they're going to say, well, as a training mechanism, if you can handle the world, then all those situations, are going to make you a much more flexible and robust person, because you take your recluse out of the woods that you put him in downtown Chicago, he's going to get perturbed. The layperson can handle, the woods, and also can handle downtown Chicago, or at least the tantric layperson. The actual Chicagoite doesn't have to be scared to death to be in the woods. So, it's like neither is comfortable, but it's possible to be comfortable in both spheres. Be comfortable when you're with people, be comfortable when you're alone, be comfortable, being in the world, engaging, and be comfortable being in solitude. But generally now we're looking to put more solitude into our lives. And I think in some ways, because of the affluence of culture here in America, you can, eventually get some time where you are pretty free. Certainly when you're retired, but even before that, you get weekends and vacations, and nobody does much of anything before they're 30 anyway. So there's a lot of free time in this culture that people could be using if they were so inclined. So we get a benefit of, we're not quite, when you were, back if you had a family in India, first you had, you were in the thick of it in a way that we have a little bit more autonomy now, a little more individual freedom. You can find solitude a little more easier than they probably could.
the other question I was thinking of was this idea of reason not being the same as wisdom, and so there's like reasoning is you need to have that to have wisdom, but then is there also a sense that like reasoning isn't wisdom because, or reason isn't wisdom because reason can go in any direction, and many of those directions are just unwise, or they're not considerate of the whole, as you said. They don't.
Well, yeah, I didn't spit that real clear, but reason, as we know, depends on what your underlying assumption is. So once you have an underlying assumption, then you can run out any kind of logical, like in geometry, you have an axiom and then you have all kinds of postulates. So you have to have some sort of fundamental view or statement, and then you can build on that. So the literal truth of the Bible. Well, if you accept that, then you can build all sorts of kinds of artifice and structures off of that. But you have that basic, and they can be rationally built. But if your assumption is fantastical to begin with, then your reasoning only is as good as your initial assumption. I mean, it can further flesh it out and so forth and so on. So that's from that point of view, wisdom it sees the quality and the what are the basic assumptions, what are the basic principles, and so it has a sense of realization. So when I see my defilements and I say, well, this habit is not a good habit, and I might go back and forth, rationally. Well, is it a bad habit, or is it just people think it's a bad habit? Is it hurting me? Does it hurt other people? So forth and so on. But wisdom cuts through all that kind of discursive quality, or that trying to get reasons lined up one way or another, and just realizes this is helpful or this is not helpful, or this is appropriate or not appropriate, or this is fine or not, just knows. So that ability to just know without having to think it out is, to my mind, wisdom. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly enough, when Nagasena asks the question, the animals have reasoning, but they don't have wisdom, I would probably flip it. I would say they're wise, but they don't have a lot of, reasoning power. Uh-huh. I mean, animals grasp things instinctively, and quite often they're wrong. I mean, they just sort of like hear noise fly off. The noise may not be a threat, but they play it on the side of caution. But they have an instinctual reaction, which is but it's immediate and spontaneous, and they don't really have a whole lot of time to, think it out. Now, apparently certain animals like crows, like to solve puzzles and stuff. That's a bit rare in the animal world.
Octopuses.
Octopuses are probably smarter than we are. So they had an article today, which is an odd one. Is it ethical to create octopus farms? I mean, these animals are pretty smart. Should we be farming them to eat? Should we be eating animals smarter than ourselves? Or,
Probably not. That's great.
I suppose it depends on how good the pickling is. If you pickle them really well, Well, if we have no more questions, maybe we should conclude for this evening. I think I'll continue with this. It's a very interesting text. I find all sorts of unusual points of Dharma here. And it's a very nice explanation. As we go through it, quite a bit of these Abhidharma categories will come out. So it's a very nice way to sort of provide the king and ourselves with a nice full understanding of the Dharma. Well, thank you again for your patience, and we'll dedicate merit.
Thanks, Bruce.
Why does merit and always hang on missions? May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the oceans of sorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Good night, everybody. See you
Have a
soon.
good weekend.
Too.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.